This is an audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography,
produced and narrated by Giribala Joshi.
Chapter 31. Negotiations at Yeravda. My father's arrest was accompanied by, or immediately preceded by, the declaration of the Congress Working Committee as an unlawful body. This led to a new development outside. The committee would be arrested en bloc when it was having a meeting. Substitute members were added to it, under the authority given to the acting presidents, and in this way several women became acting members. Kamala was one of them. Father was in very poor health when he came to jail, and the conditions in which he was kept there were of extreme discomfort. This was not intentional on the part of the government, for they were prepared to do what they could to lessen those discomforts, but they could not do much in any prison. 4 of us were now crowded together in the 4 tiny cells of my barrack. It was suggested by the superintendent of the prison that father might be kept in some other part of the jail where he might have a little more room, but we preferred to be together so that some of us could attend personally to his comforts. The monsoon was just beginning, and it was not particularly easy to keep perfectly dry even inside the cells, for the rainwater came through the roof occasionally and dripped in various places. At night it was always a problem where to put father's bed, in the little 10 feet by 5 feet veranda attached to our cell, in order to avoid the rain. Sometimes he had fever. The jail authorities ultimately decided to build an additional veranda, a fine broad one, attached to our cell. This veranda was built, and it was a great improvement. But father did not profit by it much, as he was discharged soon after it was ready. Those of us who continued to live in that barrack took full advantage of it later. Towards the end of July, there was a great deal of talk about Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru and Mr. M.R. Jakar endeavouring to bring about peace between the Congress and the government. We read about it in a daily newspaper, which was supplied as a special favour to father. We read in this paper the correspondence that had passed between the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, and Messrs. Sapru and Jakar, and then we learned that the so-called peacemakers had visited Gandhiji. We did not know at all what had induced them to take this initiative or what they were driving at. Later, we were told by them that they had been encouraged to proceed in the matter because of a brief statement that father had agreed to in Bombay a few days before his arrest. The statement had been drafted by Mr. Slocum, a correspondent of the London Daily Herald then in India, after a conversation with my father, and had been approved by the latter. Footnote: Statement dated Bombay, June 25, 1930, agreed to by Pandit Motilal Nehru. If in certain circumstances the British government and the government of India, although unable to anticipate the recommendations that may in perfect freedom be made by the Round Table Conference, or the attitude which the British Parliament may reserve for such recommendations, would nevertheless be willing to give a private assurance that they would support the demand for full responsible government for India, subject to such mutual adjustments and terms of transfer as are required by the special needs and conditions of India and by her long association with Great Britain, and as may be decided by the Round Table Conference, Pandit Motilal Nehru would undertake to take personally such an assurance, or the indication received from a responsible third party that such an assurance would be forthcoming, to Mr. Gandhi and to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. If such an assurance were offered and accepted, it would render possible a general measure of conciliation which would entail the simultaneous calling off of the civil disobedience movement, the cessation of the government's present repressive policy, and a general measure of amnesty for political prisoners, and would be followed by Congress participation in the Round Table Conference on terms to be mutually agreed upon. End of footnote. This statement considered the possibility of the Congress withdrawing the civil disobedience campaign, subject to the government agreeing to a number of conditions. It was a vague and tentative affair, and it made it quite clear that even those vague conditions could not be considered till father had a chance of consulting Gandhiji and me. I came in as the president of the Congress for the year. I remember father mentioning it to me in Naini after his arrest, and adding that he was rather sorry that he had given such a vague statement in a hurry, as it was possible that it might be misunderstood. It was indeed misunderstood, as even the most exact and explicit statements are likely to be, by people whose way of thinking is entirely different. Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru and Mr. Jaikar suddenly descended on us in Naini prison on July 27th with a note from Gandhiji. On that day and the next we had long interviews with them, which were very exhausting for father, as he was actually feverish then. We talked and argued in a circle, hardly understanding each other's language or thought, so great was the difference in political outlook. It was obvious to us that there was not the faintest chance of any peace between the Congress and the government as matters stood. We refused to make any suggestions without first consulting our colleagues of the working committee, especially Gandhiji, and we wrote something to this effect to Gandhiji. 11 days later, on August 8th, Dr. Sapru came to see us again with the Viceroy's reply. The Viceroy had no objection to our going to Yeravda, the prison in Pune where Gandhiji was kept, but he and his council could not allow us to meet Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, and other members of the working committee who were outside and were still carrying on an active campaign against the government. Dr. Sapru asked us if we were prepared to go to Yeravda under these circumstances. We told him that we had and could have no objection to going to see Gandhiji at any time, but as we could not meet our other colleagues, there was no chance of our deciding anything finally. That very day's paper, or perhaps that of the day before, had given the news of a fierce lathi charge in Bombay, and the arrest there of Vallabhbhai Patel, Malviyaji, Tasadduk Sherwani, and others as permanent or acting members of the working committee. We pointed out to Dr. Sapru that this had not improved matters, and we asked him to make the position quite clear to the Viceroy. Dr. Sapru, however, said that there would be no harm in our meeting Gandhiji as soon as possible. We had previously pointed out to him that in case we were sent to Yeravda, our colleague, Dr. Syed Mahmood, who was with us at Naini, should also go there as he was the Congress Secretary. 2 days later, on August 10th, the three of us, father, Mahmood, and I, were sent by a special train from Naini to Pune. Our train did not stop at the big stations. We rushed past them, stopping at the small wayside ones. Still news of us travelled ahead, and large crowds gathered both at the stations where we stopped and at those where we did not stop. We reached Khadki, near Pune, late at night on the 11th. We expected to be kept in the same barrack as Gandhiji, or at least to see him soon. That was the arrangement made by the superintendent of Yeravda prison, but at the last moment he had to change his arrangements because of some instructions received through the police officer who had accompanied us from Naini. Lieutenant Colonel Martin, the superintendent, would not tell us the secret, but a little subtle questioning by father made it clear to us that the idea was that we should not meet Gandhiji, for the first time at least, except in the presence of Messrs. Sapru and Jaikar. It was feared that a previous meeting between us might stiffen our attitude or make us hold together more firmly than otherwise. So that night and the whole of the next day and night we were kept apart in a separate barrack, and father was exceedingly irritated at this. It was tantalizing and annoying to be there and not to be allowed to see Gandhiji, to meet whom he had come all the way from Naini. On the forenoon of the 13th we were told that Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru and Mr. Jaikar had arrived, and Mr. Gandhi had joined them in the prison office, and we were asked to go there ourselves. Father refused to go, and only agreed after various explanations and apologies, and on condition that we should see Gandhiji alone first. At our joint request later, Vallabhbhai Patel and Jairam Das Daulatram, who had both been brought to Yeravda, as well as Sarojini Naidu, who was kept in the women's prison opposite, were allowed to join our conference. That evening, Father, Mahmood, and I were moved to Gandhiji's enclosure, and there we remained for the rest of our stay in Yeravda. Vallabhbhai Patel and Jairam Das Daulatram were also brought there for those few days to enable us to consult together. Our conferences in the prison office with Messrs. Sapru and Jaikar lasted 3 days, the 13th, 14th and 15th August, and we exchanged letters giving expression to our views and indicating the minimum conditions necessary to enable us to withdraw civil disobedience and offer cooperation to the government. These letters were subsequently published in the newspapers. Footnote: the letter containing these minimum conditions is given in Appendix B. End of footnote. The strain of these conferences had told on father, and on the 16th he suddenly got high fever. This delayed our return, and we started back on the night of the 19th, again by special train, for Naini. Every effort was made by the Bombay government to provide a comfortable journey for father, and even in Yeravda, during our brief stay there, his comforts were studied. I remember an amusing incident on the night of our arrival at Yeravda. Colonel Martin, the superintendent, asked father what kind of food he would like. Father told him that he took very simple and light food, and then he enumerated his various requirements from early morning tea in bed to dinner at night. In Naini, we used to get food for him daily from home. The list father gave in all innocence and simplicity consisted certainly of light foods, but it was impressive. Very probably at the Ritz or the Savoy it would have been considered simple and ordinary food, as father himself was convinced that it was. But in Yeravda prison it seemed strange and far away, and most inappropriate. Mahmoud and I were highly amused to watch the expression on Colonel Martin's face as he listened to father's numerous and expensive requirements in the way of food. For a long time he had had in his keeping the greatest and most famous of India's leaders, and all that he had required in the way of food was goat's milk, dates, and perhaps oranges occasionally. The new type of leader that had come to him was very different. During our journey back from Pune to Naini, we again rushed by the big stations and stopped in out-of-the-way places. But the crowds were larger still, filling the platforms and sometimes even swarming over the railway lines, especially at Hurda, Itarsi, and Sohagpur. Accidents were narrowly averted. Father's condition was rapidly deteriorating. Many doctors came to examine him, his own doctors, as well as doctors sent on behalf of the provincial government. It was obvious that jail was the worst place for him, and there could be no proper treatment there. And yet, when a suggestion was made by some friend in the press that he should be released because of his illness, he was irritated, as he thought that people might think that the suggestion came from him. He even went to the length of sending a telegram to Lord Irwin, saying that he did not want to be released as a special favour. But his condition was growing worse from day to day. He was losing weight rapidly, and physically he was a shadow of himself. On the 8th September, he was discharged after exactly 10 weeks of prison. Our barrack became a dull and lifeless place after his departure. There was so much to be done when he was with us, little services to add to his comfort, and all of us, Mahmood, Narmada Prasad and I, filled our days with this joyful service. I had given up Nevad weaving. I spun very little, and I did not have much time for books either. And now that he was gone, we reverted rather heavily and joylessly to the old routine. Even the daily newspaper stopped after father's release. 4 or 5 days later, my brother-in-law Ranjit S. Pandit was arrested, and he joined us in our barrack. A month later, on October 11th, I was discharged on the expiry of 6-month sentence. I knew I would have little freedom, for the struggle was going on and becoming more intense. The attempts of the peacemakers, Messrs. Sapru and Jaikar, had failed. On the very day I was discharged, 1 or 2 more ordinances were announced. I was glad to be out and eager to do something effective during my short spell of freedom. Kamala was in Allahabad then, busy with her Congress work. Father was under treatment at Mussoorie, and my mother and sisters were with him. I spent a busy day and a half in Allahabad before going up to Mussoorie myself with Kamala. The great question before us then was whether a no-tax campaign in the rural areas should be started or not. The time for rent collection and payment of revenue was close at hand, and, in any event, collections were going to be difficult because of the tremendous fall in the prices of agricultural produce. The world slump was now very evident in India. It seemed an ideal opportunity for a no-tax campaign, both as a part of the general civil disobedience movement and independently on its own merits. It was manifestly impossible both for landlords and tenants to pay up the foil demand out of that year's produce. They had to fall back on old reserves if they had any, or borrow. The zamindars usually had something to fall back upon, or could borrow more easily. The average tenant, always on the verge of destitution and starvation, had nothing to fall back upon. In any democratic country, or where the agriculturists were properly organized and had influence, it would have been quite impossible, under those circumstances, to make them pay much. In India, their influence was negligible, except in so far as the Congress, in some parts of the country, stood for them, and except, of course, for the ever-present fear of peasant risings when the situation became intolerable for them. But they had been trained for generations past to stand almost anything without much murmuring. In Gujarat and in some other parts, there were no tax campaigns in progress at the time, but they were almost wholly political campaigns, started as parts of the civil disobedience movement. These were areas where the Raitwari system prevailed and the peasant proprietors dealt directly with the government. Their non-payment of revenue affected the state immediately. The United Provinces were different, for we were a zamindari and talukdari area, and there were middlemen between the cultivator and the state. If the tenants stopped paying their rent, the landlord suffered immediately. A class issue also was thus raised. The Congress, as a whole, was a purely nationalist body, and included many middling jamindars and a few of the larger ones also. Its leaders were terribly afraid of doing anything which might raise this class issue or irritate the zamindar elements. So, right through the first 6 months of civil disobedience, they avoided calling for a general no-tax campaign in the rural areas, although conditions for this seemed to me to be ripe. I was not afraid of raising the class issue in this way or any other way, but I recognized that the Congress, being what it was, could not then patronize class conflict. It could, however, call upon both parties, zamindars and tenants, not to pay. The average zamindar would probably pay up the revenue demanded from him by the government, but that would be his fault. When I came out of jail in October, both political and economic conditions seemed to me to be crying out for a no-tax campaign in rural areas. The economic difficulties of the agriculturists were obvious enough. Politically, our civil disobedience activities, though still flourishing everywhere, were getting a bit stale. People went on going to jail in small numbers and sometimes in large groups, but the sting had gone from the atmosphere. The cities and the middle classes were a bit tired of the hartals and processions. Obviously something was needed to liven things up. A fresh infusion of blood was necessary. Where could this come from except from the peasantry? And the reserve stocks there were enormous. It would again become a mass movement touching the vital interests of the masses, and, what was to me very important, would raise social issues. We discussed these matters, my colleagues and I, during the brief day and a half I was at Allahabad. At short notice, we convened a meeting there of the executive of our Provincial Congress Committee, and, after long debate, we decided to sanction a no-tax campaign, making it permissive for any district to take it up. We did not declare it ourselves in any part of the province, and the Executive Council made it apply to zamindars as well as tenants to avoid the class issue if possible. We knew, of course, that the main response would come from the peasantry. Having got this permission to go ahead, our district of Allahabad wanted to take the first step. We decided to convene a representative Kisan or Peasants' Conference of the district a week later to give the new campaign a push. I felt that I had done a good first day's work after release from jail. I added to it a big mass meeting in Allahabad city, where I spoke at length. It was for this speech that I was subsequently convicted again. And then, on October 13th, Kamala and I went off to Mussoorie to spend 3 days with father. He was looking just a little better, and I was happy to think that he had turned the corner and was getting well. I remember those quiet and delightful 3 days well. It was good to be back in the family. Indira, my daughter, was there, and my 3 little nieces, my sister's daughters. I would play with the children, and sometimes we would march bravely round the house in a stately procession, led, flag in hand, by the youngest, aged 3 or 4, singing Janda Uncha Rahe Hamara, our flag song. And those 3 days were the last I was to have with father before his fatal illness came to snatch him away from me. Expecting my rearrest soon, and desiring perhaps to see a little more of me, father suddenly decided to return to Allahabad also. Kamala and I were going down from Mussoorie on the 17th October to be in time for the peasant conference at Allahabad on the 19th. Father arranged to start with the others on the 18th, the day after us. We had a somewhat exciting journey back, Kamala and I. At Dehradun, an order under Section 144 Criminal Procedure Code was served on me almost as I was leaving. At Lucknow we got off for a few hours, and I learnt that another order under Section 144 awaited me there, but it was not actually served on me, as the police officer could not reach me owing to the large crowds. I was presented with an address by the municipality, and then we left by car for Allahabad, stopping at various places en route to address some peasant gatherings. We reached Allahabad on the night of the 18th. The morning of the 19th brought yet another order under Section 144 for me. The government was evidently hot on my trail, and my hours were numbered. I was anxious to attend the Kisan conference before my rearrest. We called this conference a private one of delegates only, and so it was, and did not allow outsiders to come in. It was very representative of Allahabad district, and as far as I remember, about 1,600 delegates were present. The conference decided very enthusiastically to start the no-tax campaign in the district. There was some hesitation among our principal workers, some doubt about the success of such a venture, for the influence and the power of the big zamindars to terrorize, backed as this was by the government, was very great, and they wondered if the peasantry would be able to withstand this. But there was no hesitation or doubt in the minds of the 1,600 and odd peasants of all degrees who were present, or at any rate it was not apparent. I was one of the speakers at the conference. I do not know if thereby I committed a breach of the Section 144 order which had forbidden me from speaking in public. I then went to the station to receive my father and the rest of the family. The train was late, and immediately after their arrival I left them to attend a public meeting, a joint affair of the peasants who had come from the surrounding villages and the townspeople. Kamala and I were returning from this meeting thoroughly tired out after 8 p.m. I was looking forward to a talk with father, and I knew that he was waiting for me, for we had hardly spoken to each other since his return. On our way back our car was stopped almost in sight of our house, and I was arrested and carried off across the river Jamna to my old quarters in Naini. Kamala went on, alone, to Anand Bhavan to inform the waiting family of this new development. And, at the stroke of 9, I re-entered the great gate of Naini prison. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32. The No-Tax Campaign in the United Provinces. After 8 days' absence, I was back again in Naini, and I rejoined Sayyid Mahmud, Narmada Prasad, and Ranjit Pandit in the same old barrack. Some days afterwards, I was tried in prison on a number of charges, all based on various parts of that one speech I had delivered at Allahabad the day after my discharge. As usual with us, I did not defend myself, but made a brief statement in court. I was sentenced for sedition under Section 124A to 18 months rigorous imprisonment and a fine of rupees 500 under the Salt Act of 1882 to 6 months and a fine of rupees 100, and under Ordinance 6 of 1930, I forget what this ordinance was about, also to 6 months and a fine of rupees 100. As the last two were concurrent, the total sentence was 2 years rigorous imprisonment and in addition 5 months in default of fines. This was my 5th term. My rearrest and conviction had some effect on the tempo of the civil disobedience movement for a while. It put on a little spurt and showed greater energy. This was largely due to father. When news was brought to him by Kamala of my arrest, he had a slightly unpleasant shock. Almost immediately, he pulled himself together and banged a table in front of him, saying that he had made up his mind to be an invalid no longer. He was going to be well and to do a man's work and not to submit weakly to illness. It was a brave resolve, but unhappily no strength of will could overcome and crush that deep-seated disease that was eating into him. Yet for a few days it worked a marked change, to the surprise of those who saw him. For some months past, ever since he was at Yeravda, he had been bringing up blood in his sputum. This stopped quite suddenly after this resolve of his, and for some days it did not reappear. He was pleased about it, and he came to see me in prison and mentioned this fact to me in some triumph. It was unfortunately a brief respite, for the blood came later in greater quantities, and the disease reasserted itself. During this interval, he worked with his old energy and gave a push to the civil disobedience movement all over India. He conferred with many people from various places and issued detailed instructions. He fixed one day, it was my birthday in November, for an all-India celebration at which the offending passages from my speech, for which I had been convicted, were read out at public meetings. On that day, there were numerous lathi charges and forcible dispersals of processions and meetings, and it was estimated that on that day alone about 5,000 arrests were made all over the country. It was a unique birthday celebration. Ill as he was, this assumption of responsibility and pouring out of energy was very bad for father, and I begged of him to take absolute rest. I realized that such rest might not be possible for him in India, for his mind would always be occupied with the ups and downs of our struggle, and inevitably people would go to him for advice. So I suggested to him to go for a short sea voyage towards Rangoon, Singapore, and the Dutch Indies, and he rather liked the idea. It was arranged that a doctor friend might accompany him on the voyage. With this object in view he went to Calcutta, but his condition grew slowly worse, and he was unable to go far. In a Calcutta suburb he remained for 7 weeks, and the whole family joined him there, except Kamala, who remained in Allahabad for most of the time, doing Congress work. My rearrest had probably been hastened because of my activities in connection with the No Tax campaign. As a matter of fact, few things could have been better for that campaign than my arrest on that particular day, immediately after the Kisan conference, while the peasant delegates were still in Allahabad. Their enthusiasm grew because of it, and they carried the decisions of the conference to almost every village in the district. Within a couple of days the whole district knew that the No Tax campaign had been inaugurated, and everywhere there was a joyful response to it. Our chief difficulty in those days was one of communication, of getting people to know what we were doing or what we wanted them to do. Newspapers would not publish our news for fear of being penalized and suppressed by government. Printing presses would not print our leaflets and notices. Letters and telegrams were censored and often stopped. The only reliable method of communication open to us was to send couriers with dispatches, and even so our messengers were sometimes arrested. The method was an expensive one and required a great deal of organization. It was organized with some success, and the provincial centers were in constant touch with headquarters as well as with their principal district centers. It was not difficult to spread any information in the cities. Many of these issued unauthorized news sheets, usually cyclo-styled, daily or weekly, and there was always a great demand for them. For our public notifications, one of the city methods was by beat of drum. This resulted usually in the arrest of the drummer. This did not matter, as arrests were sought, not avoided. All these methods suited the cities and were not easily applicable to the rural areas. Some kind of touch was kept up with principal village centers by means of messengers and cyclo-styled notices, but this was not satisfactory, and it took time for our instructions to percolate to distant villages. The Kisan Conference at Allahabad got over this difficulty. Delegates had come to it from practically every important village in the district, and when they dispersed, they carried the news of the fresh decisions affecting the peasantry, and of my arrest in connection with them, to every part of the district. They became, 1,600 of them, effective and enthusiastic propagandists for the no tax campaign. The initial success of the movement thus became assured, and there was no doubt that the peasantry as a whole in that area would not pay their rent to begin with, and not at all unless they were frightened into doing so. No one, of course, could say what their powers of endurance would be in face of official or zamindari violence and terrorism. Our appeal had been addressed both to zamindars and tenants not to pay. In theory, it was not a class appeal. In practice, most of the zamindars did pay their revenue, even some who sympathized with the national struggle. The pressure on them was great, and they had more to lose. The tenantry, however, stood firm and did not pay, and our campaign thus became practically a no-rent campaign. From the Allahabad district, it spread to some other districts of the United Provinces. In many districts, it was not formally adopted or declared, but in effect tenants withheld their rents, or in many cases were wholly unable to pay them owing to the fall in prices. As it happened, neither government nor the big zamindars took any widespread action to terrorize the recalcitrant tenantry for several months. They were not sure of their ground, as they had the political struggle with civil disobedience on the one side and the economic slump resulting in agricultural distress on the other. The two merged into each other, and the government was always afraid of an agrarian upheaval. With the Round Table Conference in session in London, they were not keen on adding to their troubles in India or on giving a still more striking demonstration of strong government. The no-tax movement in the United Provinces had one important result so far as this province was concerned. It shifted the center of gravity of our struggle from the urban to the rural areas, and it thereby revitalized the movement and put it on a broader and more enduring basis. Though our city people became bored and tired, and our middle-class workers were obviously rather stale, the movement itself in the UP was as strong or even stronger than it had been at any other time. In the other provinces, this changeover from urban to rural, from political to economic issues, did not take place to the same extent, and consequently they continued to be dominated by the cities, and to suffer increasingly from the weariness of the middle-class elements. Even the city of Bombay, which had all along played a prominent part in the movement, began to grow a little stale. Defiance of authority would go on there and elsewhere, and arrests would continue, but all this seemed somewhat artificial. The organic element had gone. This was natural enough, as it is impossible to keep the masses at a certain revolutionary pitch for long periods. Ordinarily, this was a question of days, but civil disobedience had the remarkable capacity for lengthening this period to many months, and even then of carrying on at a lower pitch for an indefinite period. Government repression grew. Local Congress committees, youth leagues, etc., which had rather surprisingly carried on so far, were declared illegal and suppressed. The treatment of political prisoners in jails became worse. Government was especially irritated when people returned to jail for a second sentence soon after their discharge. This failure to bend in spite of punishment hurt the morale of the rulers. In November or early December 1930, there were some cases of flogging of political prisoners in UP prisons, apparently for offences against jail discipline. News of this reached us in Naini prison and upset us. Since then we have got used to this, as well as many worse happenings in India, for flogging seemed to me to be an undesirable infliction, even on hardened criminals of the worst type. For young, sensitive boys and for technical offences of discipline, it was barbarous. We four in our barrack wrote to the government about it, and not receiving any reply for about 2 weeks, we decided to take some definite step to mark our protest at the floggings and our sympathy with the victims of this barbarity. We undertook a complete fast for 3 days, 72 hours. This was not much as fasts go, but none of us was accustomed to fasting and did not know how we would stand it. My previous fasts had seldom exceeded 24 hours. We went through that fast without any great difficulty, and I was glad to find out that it was not such an ordeal as I feared. Very foolishly, I carried on my strenuous exercises, running, jerks, etc., right through that fast. I do not think that did me much good, especially as I had been feeling a little unwell previously. Each one of us lost 7 to 8 pounds in weight during those 3 days. This was in addition to the 15 to 26 pounds that each had lost in the previous months in Neni. Quite apart from our fasting, there was a fair amount of agitation outside against the flogging, and I believe that the UP government issued orders to its jail department not to indulge in it in future. But these orders were not to remain unchanged for long, and a little more than a year later there was going to be no lack of flogging in the jails of the United Provinces and the other provinces. Except for these occasional alarms, we lived a quiet life in prison. The weather was agreeable, for winter in Allahabad is very pleasant. Ranjit Pandit was an acquisition to our barrack, for he knew much about gardening, and soon that dismal enclosure of ours was full of flowers and was gay with colour. He even arranged in that narrow, restricted space a miniature golf course. One of the welcome excitements of our prison existence at Neni was the passage of airplanes over our heads. Allahabad is one of the ports of call for all the great airlines between East and West, and the giant planes going to Australia, Java and French Indochina would pass almost directly above our heads at Neni. Most stately of all were the Dutch liners flying to and from Batavia. Sometimes, if we were lucky, we saw a plane in the early winter morning, when it was still dark and the stars were visible. The great liner was brightly lit up, and at both ends it had red lights. It was a beautiful sight as it sailed by against the dark background of the early morning sky. Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya was also transferred to Nani from some other jail. He was kept separately, not in our barrack, but we met him daily, and perhaps I saw more of him there than I had done outside. He was a delightful companion, full of vitality and a youthful interest in things. He even started, with Ranjit's help, to learn German, and he showed quite a remarkable memory. He was in Naini when news of floggings came, and he was greatly upset and wrote to the acting governor of the province. Soon afterwards he fell ill. He was unable to bear the cold in the conditions that prevailed in prison. His illness grew serious, and he had to be removed to the city hospital and later to be discharged before his term was over. Happily, he recovered in hospital. The New Year's Day, the 1st of January 1931, brought us the news of Kamala's arrest. I was pleased, for she had so longed to follow many of her comrades to prison. Ordinarily, if they had been men, both she and my sister and many other women would have been arrested long ago, but at that time the government avoided, as far as possible, arresting women, and so they had escaped for so long. And now she had her heart's desire. How glad she must be, I thought. But I was apprehensive, for she was always in weak health, and I feared that prison conditions might cause her much suffering. As she was arrested, a pressman who was present asked her for a message, and on the spur of the moment, and almost unconsciously, she gave a little message that was characteristic of her. I am happy beyond measure and proud to follow in the footsteps of my husband. I hope the people will keep the flag flying. Probably she would not have said just that if she had thought over the matter, for she considers herself a champion of woman's right against the tyranny of man. But at that moment the Hindu wife in her came uppermost, and even man's tyranny was forgotten. My father was in Calcutta and was far from well, but news of Kamala's arrest and conviction shook him up, and he decided to return to Allahabad. He sent on my sister Krishna immediately to Allahabad and followed himself with the rest of the family a few days later. On the 12th of January he came to see me in Neni. I saw him after nearly 2 months, and I had a shock which I could conceal with difficulty. He seemed to be unaware of the dismay that his appearance had produced in me, and told me that he was much better than he had lately been in Calcutta. His face was swollen up, and he seemed to think that this was due to some temporary cause. That face of his haunted me. It was so utterly unlike him. For the first time a fear began to creep in my mind that there was real danger for him ahead. I had always associated him with strength and health, and I could not think of death in connection with him. He had always laughed at the idea of death, made fun of it, and told us that he proposed to live for a further long term of years. Latterly I had noticed that whenever an old friend of his youth died, he had a sense of loneliness, of being left by himself in strange company, and even a hint of an approaching end. But generally this mood passed and his overflowing vitality asserted itself, and we of his family had grown so used to his rich personality and the all-embracing warmth of his affection that it was difficult for us to think of the world without him. I was troubled by that look of his, and my mind was full of forebodings. Yet I did not think that any danger to him lay in the near future. I was myself, for some unknown reason, keeping poor health just then. Those were the last days of the first Round Table Conference, and we were a little amused, and I am afraid our amusement had a touch of disdain in it at the final flourishes and gestures. Those speeches and platitudes and discussions seemed unreal and futile, but one reality stood out, that even in the hour of our country's sorest trial, and when our men and women had behaved so wonderfully, there were some of our countrymen who were prepared to ignore our struggle and give their moral support to the other side. It became clearer to us than it had been before how, under the deceptive cover of nationalism, conflicting economic interests were at work, and how those with vested interest were trying to preserve them for the future in the name of this very nationalism. The Round Table Conference was an obvious collection of these vested interests. Many of them had opposed our struggle, some had silently stood aside, reminding us, however, from time to time, that they also serve who only stand and wait. But the waiting period came to a sudden end when London beckoned, and they trooped up to ensure the safety of their own particular interests and to share in such further spoils as might be forthcoming. This general lining up in London was hastened by a realization that the Congress was going increasingly to the left, and the masses were influencing it more and more. Instinctively, it was felt that if a root and branch political change came in India, it would mean the dominance, or at least the emergence into importance of various mass elements, and these would inevitably press towards radical social changes and thus endanger those vested interests. The Indian vested interests drew back from this, to them, alarming prospect, and this led them to oppose any far-reaching political change. They wanted the British to remain in India as a deciding factor, to preserve the existing social structure and the existing vested interests. This was the real thought that underlay the insistence on dominion status. A well-known Indian liberal leader once got rather irritated with me for insisting that, as an essential part of a settlement with Great Britain, the British army should withdraw immediately from India and the Indian army must be put under Indian democratic control. He went to the length of saying that even if the British government agreed to do this, he would oppose it with all his might. He opposed this obvious and essential preliminary to any kind of national freedom. Therefore, not because it was difficult of achievement under existing circumstances, but because he considered it undesirable. Partly it may be thought this was due to fear of external invasion, and he wanted the British army to protect us from this. Quite apart from the possibility or otherwise of such an invasion, it seems a humiliating thought for any Indian of spirit to ask for an outsider's protection. But I do not think this is the real reason behind the desire to keep the strong arm of the British in India. The British are required to preserve Indian vested interests against Indians themselves, against undiluted democracy, against an upsurge of the masses. So the Indian Round Table delegates, not only the declared reactionaries and communalists, but even those who called themselves progressives and nationalists, found much in common between themselves and the British government. Nationalism indeed seemed to us a term of wide and varied reach, if it included in its embrace both those who went to jail in India in furtherance of the struggle for freedom, and those who shook hands and lined up with our jailers and discussed a common policy with them. There were others also in our country, brave nationalists, fluent of speech, who encouraged the Swadeshi movement in every way, telling us that therein lay the heart of Swaraj, and calling upon their countrymen to further it even at a sacrifice. Fortunately, the movement brought no sacrifice to them. It increased their businesses and their dividends. And while many went to prison or faced the lathi, they sat in their counting houses counting out their money. Later, when aggressive nationalism became a little more risky, they toned down their speeches and condemned the extremists and made pacts and agreements with the other party. We did not really mind or care what the Round Table Conference did. It was far away, unreal and shadowy, and the struggle lay here in our towns and villages. We had no illusions about the speedy termination of our struggle or about the dangers ahead, and yet the events of 1930 had given us a certain confidence in our national strength and stamina, and with that confidence we faced the future. One incident in December or early January had pained us greatly. Mr. Srinivas Shastri, in a speech at Edinburgh, where I think the freedom of the city was presented to him, referred with some contempt to those who were going to prison in India in the civil disobedience movement. That speech, and especially the occasion for it, hurt us to the quick. For though we differed from Mr. Shastri greatly in politics, we respected him. Mr. Ramsay MacDonald had wound up the Round Table Conference with one of his usual brotherly speeches, and this seemed to contain an implied appeal to the Congress to give up its evil ways and join the happy throng. Just about that time, the middle of January 1931, the Congress Working Committee met at Allahabad, and among other matters, this speech and appeal were also considered. I was in Naini prison then, and I heard of the proceedings on my release. Father had just returned from Calcutta, and though he was very ill, he insisted on the members gathering round his bed and discussing this subject there. Someone made a suggestion in favour of a gesture to Mr. MacDonald and toning down civil disobedience. This excited Father greatly, and he sat up in bed and declared that he would not compromise till the national objective had been gained, and that he would carry on the struggle even if he was the sole person left to do so. This excitement was very bad for him, and as his temperature shot up, the doctors succeeded at last in removing the visitors and leaving him alone. Largely at his instance, the working committee passed an uncompromising resolution. Before this was published, a cable came from Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru, and Mr. Srinivas Shastri addressed to Father, requesting the Congress, through him, not to come to any decision till they had had an opportunity of a discussion. They were already on their way home. A reply was sent to the effect that a resolution had already been passed by the Working Committee, but this would be withheld from the press till Messrs. Sapru and Shastri had arrived and had a discussion. Inside the prison we did not know of these developments outside, but we knew that something was afoot, and we were rather worried. What filled our minds much more was the approach of January 26th, the first anniversary of Independence Day, and we wondered how this would be celebrated. It was observed, as we learnt subsequently, all over the country by the holding of mass meetings which confirmed the resolution of independence, and passed an identical resolution called the Resolution of Remembrance. Footnote. This resolution is given in Appendix C, end of footnote. The organization of this celebration was a remarkable feat, for newspapers and printing presses were not available, nor could the post or telegraph be utilized, and yet an identical resolution in the particular language of the province concerned was passed at large gatherings held at more or less the same times at innumerable places, urban and rural, throughout the country. Most of these gatherings were held in defiance of the law and were forcibly dispersed by the police. January 26th found us in Naini prison musing of the year that was past and of the year that was to come. In the forenoon I was told suddenly that my father's condition was serious and that I must go home immediately. On enquiry, I was informed that I was being discharged. Ranjit also accompanied me. That evening, many other persons were discharged from various prisons throughout India. These were the original and substitute members of the Congress Working Committee. The government was giving us a chance to meet and consider the situation. So in any event, I would have been discharged that evening. Father's condition hastened my release by a few hours. Kamala also was discharged that day from her Lucknow prison after a brief jail life of 26 days. She too was a substitute member of the Working Committee. End of chapter 32.